Hello, Cadre. This is a PowerPoint with audio about some of the issues we're talking about in curriculum instruction and assessment. I want to focus the first part of this on assessment issues that I think are important for you to understand or to at least have a perspective of that you don't find too often in the conventional literature, especially since No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and now ESSA have come out. We developed kind of a conventional wisdom around assessment that testing is okay if we've gone through processes of validation and making sure that it's reliable and all those kind of things. And as a result, we have a whole generation of teachers who've now been in the system for almost 15 years who know nothing other than the No Child Left Behind kind of culture of assessment. And they equate assessment and testing as if they're the same thing, and they're clearly not. So what I'm going to try to do is, first of all, try to separate that notion of testing and assessment, and then also to talk to us some about the nuances that when we really talk about assessment, what is it that we mean and what should be guiding our practice? The first one is a slide that's in front of you. When you look at the different kinds of assessment going all the way from those things we do in the classroom to standardized norm reference test, such as even Smarter Balance and PARCC and those kind of things. The higher the level, the narrower the scope of the assessment. One of the things states struggle with that use a standardized document or standardized assessment, including NESA for that matter, is they have this balancing act between how many days and how many hours do we test in order to get enough breadth of the standards. And yet when you really look at the measurement of the standards, it's a sampling kind of activity. There's no way in the world that all of the standards in Nebraska could be measured by any kind of assessment unless it took several days and several hours to do that assessment. And then the question becomes, is it worth it? So the more information or the broader the scope in terms of measuring all the things that go on in a classroom, you do the measurement in the classroom. And each step up that, you get a little narrower with a little less information in it. The second one shows kind of the same thing in the sense of accountability and school improvement. In other words, if you really want to do school improvement, you've got to use classroom-based informative multiple measures so that it will be the kind of information that informs teaching, because much of teaching is not so much what's taught, but how it's taught, how it's connected with previous learning, how it's then connected to future learning. And you're not going to get that from a standardized or large scale kind of test. And so basically, the large scale stuff is scorekeeping so that you get a discrete score. You can compare students to students. You can compare schools to schools, school districts to school districts, states to state, and so forth. But does very little to inform teaching and learning so that you can do school improvement. Here's another way to look at it. When you look at national tests versus classroom assessments, that one is for the purpose of reporting scores. The other side, the other side is for improving learning. And improving learning has to have in-depth knowledge of specific students as to what they know, what they don't know, and so forth. So here's why you can't do school improvement from the data of a large-scale standardized test, because they produce no knowledge of specific students beyond the score. It cannot take into account poverty of the student, the family life of the student, the language level that the student has, all those kind of factors that have everything to do with improving teaching and learning. And so if you want in-depth knowledge of students, you basically have to bring it from the classroom. Let's turn for a second to the notion of accountability, because the whole testing environment has assumed that the test is an accountability device, when in fact assessment is what it should be, and assessment is an instructional device. And trying to mix the two makes it very difficult to keep the purity, so to speak, or validity, so to speak, of the two kinds of instruments. So if you try to use a test informative ways to improve instruction, it's very difficult to do, because you're going to make all kinds of assumptions and generalizations that you probably are not entitled to make. And yet if you use formative measures for summative decision making, you can get yourself into a whole lot of trouble there unless you have processes that help to moderate those results in ways that allow you to aggregate from classrooms up as opposed to standardized tests at the district or state level down. Essentially, for me, I try to define accountability as you got to be doing the right things, the right processes, and then you got to be getting the right results from that. In other words, when you think about curriculum instruction and assessment, what are those right things and right processes that you should be doing, whether it's math or science or language arts or social studies or reading or whatever it is that you're doing? What are those right things, not only in terms of content and outcomes to be taught, but the strategies to teach certain kids based upon differences in gender, differences in culture, differences in socioeconomic status, and so forth, and then get the right results. So that, how do you know you're getting the right results? You disaggregate them. Is your whole school or total achievement basically a mirror of if you pulled certain groups of kids out and separated them by gender? If you separated them by racial or cultural background, would they be the same? If you separated them by kids on the free and reduced price lunch list versus those that not, that's how you know if you're getting the right kind of results. So here's what I think. If I were to be able to tell the world what I wanted accountability to be defined as, it would be this. Accountability has to be a narrative. In other words, it has to be descriptive. It simply can't be a number. You can't simply say 78% are proficient and have that be accountability, because it doesn't inform anything. It doesn't tell you 78% of what. It doesn't tell you that if that 78% is an enduring kind of score, that it will be getting, that the student will get that same score if he took it over and over again, on and on and on. So the narrative has to say who's learning. In other words, what students are learning. What about the demographics of who is learning? What is it they're learning? Who's not learning? And again, the demographics of those populations. And what is it they're not learning? And then what are we going to do about both? So if you don't have a narrative, you really aren't being accountable, because again, a test score does not have an accountability associated with it, or if it does, it's a false one. Some of the things about testing, I think, that need to be clearly understood. When you have tests as opposed to assessments, in other words, assessments meaning more classroom-based, measurements that are closer to what and when it's taught versus tests that are remote from when and what it's taught. They're large scale, standardized, all that. Tests are what then, when tests are in place, teachers are what the teacher will teach to. Tests are what the teacher will teach to, and the student defines them as their learning outcome. In other words, when I pass the test, I've learned what I'm supposed to learn. And I can think back even in the days after the Civil War when I was in high school, that there were tests that I could pass and really didn't know that much about what was being asked for, because I was a pretty good test taker. Especially if it was multiple choice, I could usually figure out what the right answer was. Second, test questions become interrogatives of the standard. In other words, if I just take the standard and turn it into a question, that's how most tests, basically large-scale tests, are developed. And there's got to be something more to the standard. Otherwise, the standard is too narrow. Take a standard like understanding. How are you going to test to see if their students really understand? Just simply say, tell me what you understand. Well, in some cases, that'd be a better test question than some of the things that we do as indicators of understanding, which when you put them all together really wouldn't add up to understanding either. But you could see how the soft sand of that kind of relationship between a test and a standards could create. And then judging student performance level based upon a single point in time measure is like using a family photograph and say, this is what our year as a life of a family has been like. No one would do that. If you wanted to talk about the year in the life of a family, you'd take a videotape of different times during the year, maybe the holidays during the year and so forth. You'd never use a single photograph to do that, yet when testing comes along, that's exactly what we do. Let me introduce you to the Nebraska State Tree, because this is kind of the dynamics of assessment and standards and all of that. Well, a little bit of tongue-in-cheek here. Goalposts and the bar that measures how high the goalposts are is what this mental model is trying to do. So when you look at the goals, our goals or standards, as so to speak, are content, up next application, and at the highest level, performance. We have states that have content standards, application standards, performance standards. We have districts that have all those and so forth. Well, the issue is you could talk all you want to about what kind of standards you have. It's where you place this bar that matters. In other words, if you have application standards where students apply knowledge or skills to a certain thing, solving problems and so forth, that's one thing. But if you then assess them on the content piece of it, but not the application part, you really have content standards by default. One of the problems with the Common Core standards is a lot of states adopted the Common Core standards, which are supposed to be somewhere up in here between performance and application, and yet the standardized tests that they use, their state test that they use is more of a content standard. Well, Park and Smarter Balance tried to create tests that were in this range, and they found them to be horribly time-consuming, horribly expensive, and then as the whole notion of Common Core became political, have dumped both the Common Core as well as the Park and Smarter Balance assessment. But here's what it would be. If you have performance standards, or at most of your standards are application or performance based, your assessment's got to be up there somewhere. Otherwise, you've got one set of standards versus a default set of standards, which are your assessment or your tests. So what should we be trying to do in assessment? Well, I think it's good when you're confused, whether you're talking about athletics, when you're talking about music and theater and so forth, and things aren't going like you want them to go back to the basics. Well, here's the basics. The word assessment is a Latin word that basically means to sit beside. In other words, assessment was always intended to be done by someone who sits beside the student, because that person's going to know what this student knows, what they're able to do, what attitudes, feelings, dispositions they have about what it is they've learned, and they're in the best place to know that. You really don't need an external or outside test to do that if that person that's sitting beside them knows what they're looking for. Well, this is the idea behind the research that is really quite crystal clear, that says if you want an accurate assessment of what students know and are able to do, ask the teacher. As a minimum, most teachers will have a student for 45 to 50 or 55 minutes a day in a particular class, and they do that for 180 days. In the case of elementary students, many of those teachers have those students to 5.5 to 6 hours a day for 180 days, and as a result, those are the people that are going to know what the student knows, what they're able to do, and what attitudes, feelings, or dispositions they have as a result of their learning. So if we would simply find a way to collect the data that's necessary to validate the teacher judgments of knowledge and skill and disposition, seems to me we'd be a whole lot further ahead than we are. I'm going to skip that slide for a second. So here's kind of what we're the juxtaposition that we're in. When we do large-scale assessments, we're trying to basically expose what students don't know. In other words, the rigor of a standardized external large-scale test is based upon who misses the questions and how many do they miss. If you had a large-scale standardized test that everybody got right, people would simply say, well, it's too easy. Regardless of whether or not they were well prepared or they learned everything and so forth, it would simply be too easy. So it becomes, how much failure do you have to have in order to judge the rigor of a test, when in fact the rigor of a test ought to be determined based on the criteria as to how well the test can be stacked up against the standard. So what we've actually turned our testing, large-scale testing, into is a forensic activity. Kids take the test somewhere in April, May, hopefully to get them back, get the results back, but they don't get back, and we do our summer data retreats. Well, the kids already passed on. The kids moved from 3rd grade to 4th grade, or 8th grade to 9th grade, or whatever it might happen to be. So it almost becomes a forensic activity. looking at what kids don't know. So any decisions made on the data you get from last year's test are going to affect